From 1925 to 1939, Kansas City was considered a wide open town. Under the rule of boss Tom Pendergast, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, voter fraud, and political corruption flourished in a city that was reputed to have the greatest sin industry in the world. During those years, the mayor was a pawn, the city boss was a crook, the police were criminals, and gangsters had more wealth and status than honest businessmen. This documentary is the story of Tom Pendergast. By 1930, the population of Kansas City had reached nearly 400,000. Throughout the West Bottoms and in much of the adjacent North Side was home to a blatant industry of sin. It was no secret that Kansas City was a wide open town, and there was one man more than any other who was behind this industry of vice and corruption, the man whom the press had heralded as one of the most interesting citizens in America and as the most powerful boss in America, was Kansas City's Tom Pendergast. The head of an extensive and complex network of influential power brokers, eventually everything in the city was either directly under his control or at least subordinate to him. Personally, he always referred to his managing structure as my organization, but almost everyone else called it the Pendergast machine. Besides his concrete business, Tom Pendergast was head of the Jackson Democratic Club. The club's headquarters was in a modest building at 1908 Main Street. Locally referred to as the Powerhouse, everyone in the city knew that it was a more important address than either the Missouri State Capitol in Jefferson City, euphemistically referred to as Uncle Tom's Cabin, or City Hall, known as the House of Pendergast. Though he held no elected position, Pendergast wielded power like a benevolent dictator and sometimes like a cruel despot. Though some would deny it, others openly accepted that within his organization were gangster elements that used violence, or at least the threat of violence, to coerce Pendergast's enemies, which was the hidden cornerstone of his political strength. Publicly, Pendergast went to great lengths to project an image of himself as a benevolent businessman and civic leader who was devoted to both family and his city. He was quoted in the press as saying, "My interest is only Kansas City and my family." Privately, he was amassing tremendous wealth because he demanded tribute from most of the legal businesses and virtually all illegal activity in the city. With his own lackeys in the press, he created a reputation for generosity, giving aid to the poor, jobs to the needy, and holiday turkeys to the indigent. The highest profile of Pendergast's charitable activity was providing Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners for the underprivileged. At a typical meal, more than 3,000 men of all races formed a line several blocks long to Kelly's restaurant at 603 Main Street. Many of the diners were from nearby flop houses and rescue missions in the West Bottoms. These indigent denizens were the bedrock foundation of the machine, because on election day they would be called upon to vote several times for machine candidates. The head of the North Side Democratic Club was a man named Johnny Lazia. Though the term was rarely used, Lazia was head of the Kansas City branch of the Mafia. Lazia was the top of the pyramid of the Kansas City bootlegging business, an estimated $5 million a year operation. He was involved in every form of vice, including gambling, prostitution, and narcotics. A soft-spoken man who wore finely tailored suits and wireless rim glasses, he had the outward appearance of an accountant or a clerk rather than what he was, which was head of the city's most ruthless organization of gangsters. Through time and attrition, Lazia had transitioned to a point where he exerted considerable control over the Kansas City Police Department. Through his connections with Tom Pendergast, He eventually was assigned to the position of hiring new police recruits. This was the tipping point for the police department, where it came under virtual complete control of Lazia and subsequently the Pendergast machine. Pendergast had long had control of every form of kickback in the city, from construction scams to slot machines. But when Lazia gained control of the police, their joint involvement in vice rose to a new level of free reign. Their partnership was a double bureaucracy of public facade and underworld violence. Pendergast's tentacles extended deep, not only in Kansas City, but also into Missouri state politics, eventually influencing the offices of the governor, U.S. senators, and beyond. Pendergast frequently selected municipal and county judges that he wanted in office and guaranteed their election using the Pendergast machine. In 1922, he selected a farmer from Grandview, Missouri, to run for county judge by the name of Harry S. Truman. Truman won by a landslide and spent over a decade in his position, which strengthened the machine throughout Jackson County. Though he cultivated the image of a benevolent boss and he maintained a very modest headquarters downtown, it was no secret that Tom Pendergast built a lavish mansion for his family at 5650 Ward Parkway. He went to great lengths to keep his home life separate, private, and insulated from his business dealings. Outside of close relatives and a few intimate friends, no one was ever invited to the Pendergast mansion. Hardly any of his political associates ever saw the inside of his home or met his family. Not the governor of Missouri, not even Harry S. Truman. Kansas City's unbridled vice was astounding in its prevalence. 12th Street was a tacky string of taxi dance joints, bars, and gambling dens that stretched for a mile east of the heart of the downtown business district. There were somewhere near 20 illegal saloons or nightclubs in each city block for that 1 mile stretch. These bars ranged from rough, bucket of blood joints with sawdust on the floor and a single honky-tonk piano player to elegant nightclubs with full orchestras and elaborate floor shows. Most clubs were open 24 hours a day with a cleanup crew that came in at 7 a.m. Patrons would move from one side of the bar to the other as custodians cleaned, and then the festivities started in full swing again when the janitorial crews were done. Tom Pendergast had once owned several saloons in the West Bottoms, but in 1912 he had sold his saloon interests to one of his business partners and focused on wholesale liquor sales only. With his influence in the city council, Pendergast could issue code violations to any business he wanted to. With his power, he coerced all the saloons in the First Ward to purchase liquor exclusively from his wholesale liquor distributor, monopolizing the market. In 1919, when the Volstead Act was passed and prohibition would go into effect the following year, Pendergast sued in federal court declaring prohibition unconstitutional. After he lost the case and accepted that prohibition would be the way of the future, he immediately changed his business portfolio and closed his wholesale liquor company. He stored the unsold liquor in government warehouses, reconfigured his operation into a medicinal water and soft drink company, and renamed it the T.J. Pendergast Distributing Company. Determined not to leave himself vulnerable to federal liquor violations, he wisely avoided any direct contact with bootlegging throughout Prohibition. With his contacts in the liquor business, he was perfectly positioned to go into bootlegging, but he fully understood that if he were caught up in any kind of legal accusations in violating this new law, it would be politically damaging, And first and foremost, Tom Pendergast was a politician. Why risk his own political reputation when he had the clout to make or break anyone in this illegal business and still profit handsomely from the protection money paid by those taking the risks? Even though he had sold his saloons and closed his wholesale liquor business, he was still firmly entrenched in the business of booze, albeit behind the scenes. Though prohibition was a national law, the liquor stores throughout the city operated with impunity and openly displayed their wares of whiskey, wine, and beer. And the only brand available in Kansas City was mistletoe. Shelves were stacked with mistletoe wine, mistletoe gin, mistletoe beer, and mistletoe bourbon. And though it was near impossible to link Tom to bootlegging, everyone knew that mistletoe meant Pendergast. All during Prohibition, there were hundreds of speakeasies in Kansas City that operated with total impunity because not only did Boss Tom influence and profit from the liquor business, but he also controlled the police force who likewise profited from the illegal trade. The rough and tumble West Bottoms was home to an area euphemistically known as the wettest block in the world, a 1 block long stretch of Ninth Street between State Line Road and Genesee Street. It was home to the establishment at 1717 West Ninth Street that was once the Pendergast Brothers Saloon and now home to the Antlers Club. There were 25 saloons that occupied all but 2 storefronts. This city block was the nucleus of a community of vice containing brothels, casinos, and gambling dens. In Kansas City, gambling was completely in the open. Just ask any cop, and they would give directions to the 12th Street Gambling District. There was the Turf, which was the biggest of over 100 bookmaking parlors. Baltimore Recreation was home to the biggest blackjack game in the city that ran 24 hours a day, and according to some sources, pulled in over $1 million a year in revenues. There was 12th Street Recreation, which was home to the crap shooting tables. In Midtown, there was the Fortune Club, a casino that specialized in slot machines. Nearly every drugstore or small mom and pop shop in the city had at least one slot machine. The Kansas City Star noted that children had free and easy access to the one-armed bandits and were squandering their milk money. Illegal gambling in Jackson County, Missouri, was one of the biggest industries in the city, with gross annual profits exceeding $20 million. And all these illegal establishments operated with complete impunity to the law as long as they paid their lug. The lug was about 20% of the house profits, and it was paid directly to Kansas City mob boss Johnny Lazia. 60% of that lug was divided between Lazia and his top officers, and 40% went to Boss Tom. The crown jewel in Johnny Lazia's gambling empire was the luxurious Cuban Gardens. This casino was supposedly bringing in over $2 million a year. Nearby the Cuban Gardens was Tom Pendergast's Riverside Horse Racetrack. Even though the state of Missouri had banned pari-mutuel betting, Pendergast had the kind of political clout to completely ignore the law. Because of his passion for horse racing, he had built the Riverside Racetrack just north of the river, about 5 miles from downtown. The grandstand could accommodate 17,000 spectators who would gather to flaunt the state law. Kansas City's red light district lined both sides of 14th Street, where over 250 houses of ill repute operated openly in a 4-block stretch east from downtown. Most were smaller establishments with no sign advertising either their name nor their wares, but there were a half a dozen large houses that proudly displayed their name on the front of the building, like the Winnie Winkle, the Blue Goose, the Bowery, the Oriental, the Jubilesta, and the Stork Club. The Chesterfield Club, located at 320 East 9th Street, was only 1 block from the federal courthouse. The waitresses wore nothing except high-heeled shoes and a see-through cellophane apron. On Friday afternoons, the Pendergast machine held regular meetings at the Chesterfield as a reward for its top officers. Meetings included nude dancers and ribald sex parties. Though top-ranking precinct workers faithfully attended, Boss Tom never participated. The famous broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow once said, "If you want to see some sin, forget Paris and go to Kansas City. Except for such renowned centers as Singapore and Port Said, Kansas City probably has the greatest sin industry in the world." Kansas City's rank-and-file policemen were rough characters. Most had been appointed by and were loyal to the Pendergast machine. Their primary duties were assisting in voter fraud and protecting the vice rackets. Any citizen on the street could approach a cop for directions to alcohol, gambling, or prostitution. Eventually, Tom Pendergast virtually handed over the entire police department to gangster Johnny Lazia. After Prohibition went into effect, Boss Tom focused his efforts on his two legitimate occupations, the ready-mix concrete company and his chair as head of the Jackson Democratic Club. He spent 3 days a week at the Jackson Democratic Club at 1908 Main, 2 days a week at the ready-mix concrete company, and was always home in time for supper with his family. With his absolute control of the city government, all he had to do was insist that the local politicians and police protect the rackets, and in turn he received a handsome tribute. And that tribute was under the table, not traceable, non-taxable cash. Pendergast's other very lucrative form of corruption was that he also controlled every construction contract that the city issued, most of which just happened to be awarded to the ready-mix concrete company. Between bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and graft, it was estimated that Tom Pendergast received around $20 million a year. This placed Pendergast well below Al Capone's estimated income of $60 million a year, but when it came to illicit income, Boss Tom was among the biggest players in the nation. Most Kansas Cityans knew that the address at 1908 Main Street meant Tom Pendergast. On business days, favor seekers formed a line at least a block long outside of his office. No one from governors and senators down to Skid Row bums received any kind of preferential treatment except women. Pendergast's standing orders were ladies first, and any woman found standing in line would immediately be ushered all the way to the front. Pendergast's office was austere, and his meetings were brief and to the point. Separate from Tom Pendergast's Jackson Democratic Club was Johnny Lazia's North Side Democratic Club. Lazia was the top-ranking member of the Mafia, head of the police department, in charge of all bootlegging in Kansas City, and ran his own branch of the Democratic Party. Located on the southwest corner of 5th and Grand, from these headquarters, Johnny Lazia and his two top officers, Charlie Carolla and Charles Benaggio, ran Kansas City's bootlegging operation. In the early 1930s, a young hotshot agent from the Internal Revenue Service named Harry D. Beach took it upon himself to investigate Johnny Lazia for income tax evasion. Agent Beach discovered that Lazia did his business with the Merchants Bank and subsequently subpoenaed bank records. What he found was a steady stream of transactions amounting to approximately $100,000 for the years 1929 and 1930, 2 years for which Johnny Lazia failed to file tax returns. Agent Beach contacted Lazia and arranged a meeting at his IRS office. Lazia had attempted to bribe Beach, after which there was a shouting match, and then Beach let it be known he would move forward with his investigation into income tax evasion. 4 days later, two unidentified men went to Beach's apartment at the Berkshire Arms Hotel and beat the young agent into a coma. Beach never regained consciousness, and a few days later he died in the hospital. There was a brief investigation, but Johnny Lazia had an ironclad alibi, and the two assailants were never identified or apprehended. In 1932, Tom Pendergast personally selected a relatively unknown Jackson County Judicial Circuit Court judge named Guy Brassfield Park to run for governor of Missouri. Pendergast had already seized control of the House and was now backing his own candidate for governor. Park won the election by over 300,000 votes. Now, with the governor in his pocket, Pendergast's control at the state level was so complete that the capital in Jefferson City was jokingly referred to as Uncle Tom's Cabin. After Park was elected, it became virtually impossible for any Democrat in the state of Missouri to run for any public office without the approval of Boss Tom. Upon taking office, Governor Park immediately established state relief programs to combat financial hardships that many were suffering due to the Great Depression. He coordinated state affairs with federal relief programs like the Works Progress Administration. It was well known that Park was Pendergast's man in the state capitol, and the speculation was that Boss Tom ran the state of Missouri through Park. It was widely accepted that federal relief money that came from Washington to the Missouri Capitol was then diverted to Kansas City, and more specifically to businesses owned by Pendergast. In June of 1933, a horrific event took place in Kansas City that shocked the nation. On the morning of June 17, 1933, a broad daylight shootout made headlines across the nation. Triggerman Vernon C. Miller, bank robber Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd, and psychopathic alcoholic Adam Machine Gun Richetti converged on Kansas City's Union Station, resolved to free convicted bank robber Frank Jelly Nash, who was being transferred from Hot Springs, Arkansas, to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Nash had been recaptured in Arkansas after escaping from Leavenworth and was being escorted by two FBI agents and an Oklahoma sheriff. When their Missouri Pacific train pulled into the massive Union Station, they were met by two Kansas City-based FBI agents and a couple of trusted local police, a rare commodity in Kansas City. The police escorts exited the front of the train station, quickly loaded Nash into a waiting Chevrolet sedan parked near the entrance, and were preparing to drive him to Leavenworth. In one of the most conspicuous locations in the city, wielding machine guns, Miller, Floyd, and Richetti got the drop on the agents. Witnesses reported that someone yelled, "Let 'em have it," at which time the gunmen opened fire. After a hailstorm of gunfire, when the smoke cleared, 4 of the officers and Nash lay dead in front of the bustling train station. The outlaws jumped into their car and sped away. Upon hearing about the shootings, Johnny Lazia, who was a high-ranking member of the Kansas City Police Department, rushed to Union Station and, acting as an investigator, supervised the search for evidence. Though not public knowledge, the night before the shootout, Johnny Lazia was formally introduced to the 3 gunmen and gave his blessing for the freeing of Nash. Lazia had also provided a safe house in the Country Club Plaza district where the assailants had hidden out after the bloodbath. One of the three triggermen received a shoulder wound and was treated at the safe house by one of Lazia's mob doctors. Later, Lazia personally made the arrangements for the killers to leave town, providing them with a new car and an escort. The national publicity in the wake of the Union Station massacre confirmed in the minds of many that Kansas City was a safe haven for criminals, and some papers labeled it the crime capital of the U.S. Two of the wounded and two of those who died were federal agents. J. Edgar Hoover capitalized on the drama of the event to solicit Congress to issue more power to his fledgling FBI. Tom Pendergast kept a low profile, issuing no formal statement, but local Kansas City newspapers that were on Tom's payroll published stories stating that crime of this nature was a national epidemic and not unique to nor representative of Kansas City, implying that it could have happened anywhere. Frank Nash's fatal wound was to the back of the head. It is possible that one of the agents shot him during the melee. No one will ever be certain of what actually happened during that 90-second shootout at the Union Station, but much of the aftermath is known. The FBI requested assistance from the Kansas City Police Department in the investigation, but received no help. Lazia's Kansas City police were conspicuously silent in response. Tom Pendergast's personally selected Jackson County Judge Harry S. Truman had been consistently reelected to his position and had been serving the public as a member of Pendergast's machine for over a decade when Boss Tom approached him about running for U.S. Senator from Missouri. In May of 1934, Pendergast specifically selected Truman as the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate. In his public announcement of his support for Truman, Pendergast said, "He has been a most efficient and trustworthy public official in Jackson County and has rendered splendid service as Director of Reemployment and enjoys the confidence of state and national administrations. We will put forth our best efforts on his behalf." In an article in the Missouri Democrat, they referred to Judge Truman and Boss Tom as close friends. Like most Missouri elections, Truman's victory was a lopsided landslide, and his ascension to U.S. Senator immediately paid dividends to the Pendergast machine. One of his first actions taken was when Senator Truman appointed former Missouri State Highway Commissioner Matthew S. Murray to a position as Director of the Works Progress Administration for the state. Murray, who was a pawn in the Pendergast machine, was now in charge of most relief jobs and recovery projects across the state, which meant that federal funds for these projects went through Murray and into the pockets of Boss Tom and his associates. Truman's improbable ascent from a little-known rural politician to U.S. Senator and beyond was only made possible because of Tom Pendergast's personal interest in and backing of the farmer from Grandview. It is a very easy argument to make that without Pendergast's involvement, Truman would never have chosen to run for the Senate, let alone been successfully elected. Once established in Washington, behind his back, he was referred to as the Senator from Pendergast. Certain that Truman was strictly a pawn in Pendergast's corrupt machine, he was initially dismissed as a messenger boy for Boss Tom. Johnny Lazia's high-profile lifestyle continued to draw attention from the IRS, and on February 14, 1934, he was convicted of federal income tax evasion, charged with a $5,000 fine, and sentenced to a 1-year jail sentence. His lawyers immediately appealed the case, and that summer of 1934, Lazia was free on appeal. On May 12, 1934, Tom Pendergast himself wrote a letter to Postmaster General James Farley, insisting that Johnny Lazia was being jobbed of his democratic activities, and that my interest in his is greater than anything that might come up in the future. Boss Tom specifically wanted Farley, who handled political problems for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to request executive clemency for Lazia. Unfortunately for Johnny Lazia, James Farley's influence did not include the Western Missouri judicial system, but Pendergast's fervent attempts to acquire clemency for Lazia would soon be of no importance. At 3 a.m. on Tuesday, July 10th, 1934, Johnny Lazia was gunned down in front of his residence at the Park Central Hotel at 300 East Armour Boulevard. After a night of touring his nightclubs and gambling establishments with his wife Marie and right-hand man Charlie Carolla, Lazia returned to his home at the fashionable Midtown Park Central. Charlie and Marie were in the front seat. Johnny had gotten out of the back of the car and was opening the door for his wife when two or more gunmen armed with a submachine gun and a sawed-off shotgun came out of the nearby bushes. Lazia pushed his wife back into the front seat and ordered Carolla to drive off. As the car pulled away, the gunman blasted Lazia and he collapsed on the circular driveway of the Park Central. Charlie Carolla and Marie Lazia were unharmed. Lazia was taken by ambulance to St. Joseph Hospital. Still conscious, Lazia spoke to his doctors, reportedly saying, "Doc, what I can't understand is why anybody would do this to me. Why to me, to Johnny Lazia, who has been the friend of everybody." Word of the shooting spread quickly, and a group of Johnny's henchmen gathered at the hospital entrance to guard against any further attempts on his life. Tom Pendergast arrived and consulted with his own personal physicians to do what they could to save Lazia's life. All efforts failed, and 11 hours later he died of his gun wounds. Johnny Lazia's was the largest funeral that anyone living in Kansas City could recall. Thousands of citizens from all walks of life filed past his casket. The funeral procession was made up of hundreds of automobiles, including Tom Pendergast. There was a brief graveside service before he was lowered into the ground at Mount St. Mary's Cemetery. Afterwards, there was an official Johnny Lazia wake which drew over 7,000 mourners. Local Kansas City newspapers, who were mouthpieces of the machine, had stories that included the lines, "One of the most lovable men imaginable, a lovable character," and "a poor man's friend." Lazia loved Mr. Pendergast with a dog-like devotion, and there had never been a time during the past 6 years when he would not have died for him. The headlines in the New York Times read, "Democratic Leader Slain in Kansas City." Nowhere within the Times article did it mention the words graft, corruption, vice, gangster, racketeer, or mob ties. Unlike the aftermath of the Union Station massacre, where Kansas City police provided no cooperation with federal agents, after Lazia's murder, local police acted swiftly and aggressively. Associates inside of Lazia's criminal organization blamed the heroin-addicted mob hitman Michael Jimmy Needles LaCapra for Lazia's death. Jimmy Needles was Kansas City's #1 opium and heroin wholesaler, and initial assassination attempts of LaCapra failed. Ironically, through ballistics, Kansas City police traced some of the bullets taken from Lazia's body to bullets found at the Union Station massacre. Though technically Lazia's murder was never solved, the ballistics results made several insiders suspicious that it was one of Johnny's allies who murdered him. LaCapra was eventually shot and killed on August 18, 1935, where he was found in hiding at a farm in upstate New York. With the promise of heroin, he was lured into a drug deal that was actually an ambush where he was shot twice in the back of the head. With the assistance of the Pendergast machine, Charlie Carolla stepped up into Johnny's old role as mob boss of Kansas City. At the same time, Boss Tom appointed Otto Higgins as the new Kansas City chief of police. Carolla and Higgins became heads of the new mob/police alliance and spearheaded various criminal activities in the city. In March of 1936, Pendergast and his wife went on a tour of Europe. They returned on the first transatlantic voyage of the Queen Mary, arriving in New York City on June 2nd. He rented a suite on the 29th floor of the Waldorf Astoria and held court with a multitude of Democratic politicians in the days before the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. While in New York, he suffered a severe coronary thrombosis and was hospitalized where his condition became worse. Local physicians said he was in a critical, life-threatening situation and recommended he take 6 months rest. In August, he stabilized enough to be dismissed from the hospital and returned to a New York hotel. He had lost 35 pounds and was still seriously ill. Then he suffered an intestinal blockage and was readmitted to the hospital for emergency surgery. After a partial recovery, he traveled by private railroad car back to Kansas City, where upon arriving he was directly admitted to Menorah Hospital, where a colostomy was performed, and he spent the rest of 1936 recovering. Boss Tom's various illnesses kept him away from the day-to-day running of the Pendergast machine. Though every election year was notorious for voter fraud, the 1936 elections were so obviously fraudulent that they received serious criticism in the press and came under scrutiny of a local grand jury. In the previous decades, the machine had run local elections like a well-oiled clock. Registration took place only on days specified by the machine, with Pendergast's henchmen running the process. Machine judges made up laws to enforce the fraudulent process. Thousands of registered voters were those either with fabricated names of people who did not exist or were people who had died in years past. On election day, prostitutes, pimps, petty criminals, and homeless vagrants who received 26 cents per vote traveled to various precincts, casting multiple ballots. But in 1936, with Boss Tom absent, local machine members took things a little too far. Somewhere close to 80,000 ghosts voted in the 1936 election. Critics claimed that the election was so corrupt it was a disgrace to American civilization. The Pendergast machine came under fire in the Kansas City Star, one of the few publications in the city not under Boss Tom's thumb, which stated that an honest election here is an utter impossibility. The 1936 election was so out of hand that even Boss Tom publicly denied responsibility. I was ill throughout the primary registration and election period and know nothing of the conditions referred to. In January of 1937, Lloyd Stark was elected as governor of Missouri. Though he was a Democrat, he was not part of Pendergast's political machine, backed by other forces in the state of Missouri. In 1939, Governor Stark sent a contingent of agents from the state capital to Kansas City for the express purpose of enforcing state regulations to the letter of the law. First, focusing on the 18th and Vine district, Stark's officers required clubs to comply with state laws forcing them to close at 2 a.m. and to remain closed all day on Sunday. These restricted operating hours had an immediate impact not only on the number of hours that clubs were open, but also on the quality of nightlife in the Jazz District. By late 1938, Governor Stark escalated his program of law enforcement, expanding his focus to corruption, gambling, and other forms of vice. He cracked down further on the flagrant violation of state liquor laws, which had fostered the environment in which the Kansas City Jazz Renaissance had flourished. In his campaign against corruption, Stark directed Missouri Attorney General Roy McKittrick to select officers that would do whatever it took to clean up vice and corruption in Tom's town. On December 23, 1938, Stark's orders were printed on the front page of the Kansas City Star. Within them, Stark asserted that the gambling racket is carried on openly in defiance of the law and without protest from any official heads of the city's government, that houses of prostitution flourish within the very shadows of the courthouse and city hall, and the inmates solicit openly, unashamed and unafraid of official authority. It is apparent to all that there is an open and notorious violation of the liquor laws of Missouri and an utter disregard and disrespect for the provisions of that act. After the article in the Star, a virtual army of state officers performed raids on gambling dens, brothels, and nightclubs across the city. Nearly overnight, the atmosphere of the nightlife in Tomstown went from one of wide open gaiety to dullness and gloom. In a town where the party never stopped, now 18th and Vine was closed and dark after 2 a.m. Tom Pendergast was a shrewd operator who had always insulated himself from the massive vice and corruption taking place in Kansas City, always having people who could take the fall placed between him and the actual crimes being committed, had made it difficult for anyone to acquire any evidence of wrongdoing against him. But in 1939, investigators assembled a case that would be the undoing of Boss Tom. Pendergast was a compulsive gambler, losing as much as $100,000 a week at the horse tracks. He was known by bookies far and wide as a sucker. Vast amounts of Kansas City vice revenues funneled through Tom to pay his gambling debts. With his ever-present need for more cash and his willingness to use dishonest methods, in 1935, Tom got involved in an opportunity to receive a large sum of tainted money. This crime differed from his normal kickbacks from Kansas City businessmen and shakedown of gambling dens because it was an insurance scam. It took almost 4 years for investigators to build a case against Pendergast. It involved a very complicated bureaucratic shuffling of insurance funds. Tom had gotten wind of an entangled court case where the federal judge ordered a large amount of insurance equity to be placed in escrow while the case was being determined. Parties approached Pendergast and offered to pay him $750,000 if he could bring influence on the right parties to make the deal go down favorable to the insurance companies. Technically, under federal law, this was not a bribe, but rather influence peddling. If he had paid income taxes on the payment, he would have avoided any kind of evasion investigation. But Pendergast had powerful enemies, and when federal investigators learned the details, they set out to make a case against Boss Tom. Pendergast had a way with numbers and could keep sums in his head. He kept very few accounting records, rarely used a bank account for any kind of transfer of funds, accepted cash payments only, and paid all expenditures in cash. On rare occasions, when he wired money, he did so under assumed names. All these practices made it very difficult for investigators to track his finances and build any kind of case against him. Reliable machine insiders divulged that Pendergast had bet over $2 million on horse races in 1936 alone. The IRS estimated that he had failed to report over $1 million in income in the 10 years prior to beginning their investigation. But the $750,000 influence payment was a financial transaction that the IRS had hard evidence for. When Pendergast first learned that the IRS was investigating him, he reached out to friends in high places to do anything they could to stop the investigation or at least assist him in defending himself. Senator Harry S. Truman was Tom's man in Washington, D.C. Missouri Governor Lloyd Stark owed his 1936 election to Boss Tom. Pendergast had even played a role in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential nomination in 1932, and FDR had occasionally called Pendergast's home asking about his health. But when the boss was under federal investigation, his friends in high places stepped aside. The IRS brought charges of 2 counts of attempted income tax evasion. Due to the government's airtight case, on May 19, 1939, Tom Pendergast's lawyers announced that he would plead guilty to all charges. A cooperative admission of guilt usually meant a defendant would receive a lighter sentence than if the case went to a jury trial. When Pendergast pled guilty to the charges, it was a blow to the confidence of low-ranking machine members and devoted citizens who believed in the boss. But Tom and his lawyers knew that by not going to trial, they would not have to disclose any sordid details of machine corruption. It was a smart move to keep publicity to a minimum if the judge would be lenient when it came time to impose the sentence. Before sentencing, lawyers stressed Pendergast's failing health and tried to evoke sympathy for his gambling addiction. Though the judge did take his health into consideration, it is doubtful that many people in 1939 would have seen compulsive gambling as an illness. At a time when millions of Americans were out of work and millions more struggling to make ends meet, few could find compassion for the boss's exorbitant lifestyle and excessive gambling. On the first count of tax evasion, the judge sentenced Pendergast to 15 months in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. On the second count, Tom received a 3-year prison term and a $10,000 fine, but the second charge was suspended and he received 5 years probation instead, with several stipulations. He would have to pay the $10,000 fine plus over $430,000 in delinquent taxes. When the judge stipulated that he will not be permitted to bet on the races or gamble in any form, he will not be permitted directly or indirectly to take part in any sort of political activity unless his full civil rights shall be restored by presidential pardon. He will not be permitted to visit 1908 Main Street during his probation. The boss of Kansas City was going to prison for 15 months, but equally as devastating was the fact that by the stipulation of his probation, the judge had effectively ended Pendergast's career in politics. Several people tried to take credit for ending Tom Pendergast's reign over Kansas City, including Governor Stark, J. Edgar Hoover, and even FDR, though there were several investigators and prosecutors that played a key role in the fall of Boss Tom. It was Pendergast's own insatiable greed and arrogance that brought about his own demise. He evidently thought that he was above the law, could steal from the public, and get away with it. Rather than surrendering to the U.S. Marshal as required by Judge Otis, on May 29, 1939, Pendergast's son Tom Jr. drove him to the prison, where he outwitted the throngs of journalists and entered the prison through a side door. Prior to his very public conviction and sentencing, Pendergast bore a good reputation among most Kansas Cityans, though it was common knowledge that he was boss of the political machine who had henchmen who committed crimes. Pendergast's personal integrity was not commonly questioned. But after the trial made details of his empire known public, the majority of citizens turned against him. When Pendergast went to prison in May of 1939, the machine that he had spent over a decade building did not fold overnight. To most machine members, having the boss in prison was unfortunate and inconvenient, but certainly wasn't going to bring about the end of their reign of power. The Pendergast machine was one of the most powerful political organizations in the entire nation, and in theory, still controlled all municipal government in Kansas City, and machine members placed in the judiciary and other elected positions still exercised great influence at the state level. Pendergast's subordinates were still in charge of several of FDR's New Deal programs, providing relief across the state. There was even speculation that Harry S. Truman would return from Washington to Kansas City to run the machine with Tom's nephew Jim Pendergast. No one at the time could have predicted how much more Senator Truman was going to achieve in his political career. But in reality, Boss Tom was the Pendergast machine, and without his direct guidance, the machine he led quickly disintegrated. Political machines in Chicago and New York survived despite leadership changes, but not in Kansas City. Boss Tom stood alone as Pendergast, and when he went down, the machine went down with him. Within the city's municipal government, hundreds of employees lost their jobs, most of whom were Pendergast appointees who did little more than run political errands. Reform programs swept through the city, closing the remaining gambling dens and brothels. The WPA was placed under the newly reformed Governor Stark, and then in late 1939, several other key machine members followed Tom to Leavenworth Penitentiary. In October of 1939, the mob boss, Charlie Carolla, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for mail fraud, perjury, and income tax evasion. His number two man, Charles Benaggio, stepped up into mob boss of the city. There were still many ties between the mafia and the police department, but with the clampdown on vice and the closing of most of the rackets, Benaggio inherited a withering empire. Near the same time, former police chief Otto Higgins was also convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to Leavenworth. With an anti-Pendergast movement taking place at the state level, a special session of the General Assembly placed the Kansas City Police Department into state hands. In July of 1939, just 6 weeks after Pendergast went to prison, the state appointed Lear B. Reed as Kansas City's new chief of police. Reed was a former FBI agent and a devotee of J. Edgar Hoover. Upon assuming his new position as chief of police, Reed was astounded at the corruption he found within the city's law enforcement. After decades of control by mob bosses Johnny Lazia and Charlie Carolla, the Kansas City Police Department was rampant with mob-appointed officers. Immediately upon taking his new position, Reed was bombarded with bribe offers to maintain the status quo. But machine operatives had misjudged Reed, who was on a mission to clean up Kansas City. Among all the vice that was interwoven into the police department, the one that disturbed Reed the most was the dirty business of narcotics. In a public statement, Reed asserted that even if we could overlook the crookedness, ghost voting, job selling, fixing, framing, lugging, country bookkeeping, numbskull prosecutors, piano player management, wholesale grand larceny in high places, and all the other phases of the fiasco of the heart of America, no man or woman with a spark of decency or conscience could condone a political outfit that not only permitted but aided and abetted the narcotics traffic. As Reed clamped down on vice and purged the Kansas City Police Department of corrupt officers, the revenues that flowed from vice to the police to the machine coffers dried up, and as the funds diminished, so did the power of the machine. As the corruption of Boss Tom became public knowledge and his political machine ground to a halt, federal Judge Albert L. Reeves issued this statement regarding Pendergast. He thoroughly understood the psychology of the underworld, and the habitues of the shadowy kingdom followed him blindly as well as devotedly. He protected them from prosecution for their misdeeds and granted them commissions to sin against the laws of God and man. His past experience had qualified him to lead and rule the refuse of society. He understood the life of the brothel and houses of ill fame. Election victories were made personal. He was in fact the victor, never his party. To achieve victory, he marshaled and controlled every element of human society. For window dressing and good appearance, he enlisted the support of ambitious and pliable individuals who were willing to serve for the rewards of office. He derived immense revenues from graft in public office and from his levies on crime. To support his invisible government, he deemed it prudent to increase his power over elections and to take away every element of chance. All citizens, to be secure, were forced to acknowledge the uncontrolled and despotic power of one man with his invisible empire. He lived in luxury and wealth and reveled in his despotic power. With the end of the Pendergast machine came the end of wide open vice. It either abruptly ended or went underground. Most of the jazz venues either shut down or withered away. For many musicians in the Midwest, Kansas City was home base. Because of Boss Tom's embrace of vice, Kansas City had become the wide open town that was a hotbed for jazz music. With Pendergast in prison, both his political machine and the city's nightlife ground to a halt altogether. During the 1920s and 30s, when Kansas City was the boomtown of jazz and musicians could play around the clock, they had experienced no depression and no lack of work. But when the wide open town closed its doors and the musicians drifted away, dispersing to all parts of the country, the Kansas City Jazz Renaissance came to an end. In August of 1940, Tom Pendergast was released from prison. He borrowed money from machine associates to pay his massive fines to the IRS. With his political career ended and his machine gone, he retired. With the very public scandal of his criminal conviction, his wife left him. With his health failing, he retreated to his mansion on Ward Parkway, where he lived in a small room near the kitchen. And then, on January 26, 1945, at the age of 72, Tom Pendergast died. Harry S. Truman, who by 1945 had risen from U.S. Senator to Vice President of the United States, arranged to be transported by U.S. Army bomber from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City and arrived at the church just minutes before the funeral service began and departed very shortly afterwards. Truman was criticized in the press for attending the funeral of a convicted felon, but regarding Pendergast, Truman went on the record stating that he has always been my friend and I was his. If you enjoyed this documentary and have an interest in how Pendergast's wide open town spawned the Kansas City Jazz Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s, or would like to learn more about the mafia's control of Kansas City vice in the wake of Pendergast's death, then I urge you to seek out my book, Rebellion, a 300-year saga of one family struggle with authority, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, New Orleans Storyville, Pendergast's Kansas City, the Haight-Ashbury, and beyond.